A chip that took the Western semiconductor industry 20 years and a supply chain spanning a dozen countries to make possible, China's labs claim to have patterned its equivalent geometry without the machine that was supposed to make it impossible to do without. The question is not whether China can buy that machine. It cannot. The question is whether China's workaround clock reaches useful scale before ASML's lead compounds beyond the point where crossing it matters at all. One pulse of patterning light holds this entire contest in a single moment. A photon source fires through a lens stack, lands on a wafer coated in photoresist, and burns a geometry into silicon. That pulse is the atomic unit of everything that follows. Every leg of this race is about who controls that pulse, how small it draws, how many passes it needs to draw it, and how fast it can repeat that act 100,000 times a month without the geometry drifting. The gap between the two clocks is not a fixed distance. It is a rate. Whether ASML's clock is still pulling away, or whether China's parallel track is beginning to close the splits, leg by leg, before the finish line moves again, that is the race this video runs. Start at the machine itself. ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography platform, the TwinScan NXE series, took roughly 2 decades to commercialize. Early research partnerships in the 1990s, first customer shipments in the early 2010s, volume production readiness later that decade. The light source alone comes from Trumpf in Germany. The mirrors come from Zeiss. Stages, positioning systems, and optical components come from other European and American specialists that took years to qualify. ASML has publicly stated that each machine contains hundreds of thousands of parts. The price per unit, also disclosed publicly, runs into the hundreds of millions of dollars. No single company built it. No single country supplied it. The supplier network is not a list of vendors. It is a compounded web of qualification relationships, tolerance agreements, and process secrets accumulated over a generation. Think of extreme ultraviolet lithography not as a camera, but as a concert hall. The acoustics, the stage, the instrument makers, the sheet music publishers, and the musicians all had to evolve together over decades before the sound was right. You cannot replicate the hall by building a louder speaker in a garage. The question China is actually asking is not how to build the concert hall. The question is whether every performance actually needs it. China's domestic lithography champion, Shanghai Microelectronics Equipment Group, has publicly reported development of deep ultraviolet tools at 28 nanometer production capability, with more advanced nodes under development. Independent analysts and trade press reports consistently place the company's most advanced demonstrated tools well behind ASML's leading deep ultraviolet generation, let alone extreme ultraviolet. The Huawei Mate 60 Pro chip that drew enormous analyst attention in 2023 was manufactured at SMIC using ASML deep ultraviolet tools already inside the country before the tightest export controls took effect. It was not made on domestic lithography equipment. The result was remarkable given the constraints, but the machine that enabled it was purchased abroad, not built at home. ASML's clock, roughly 2 decades and a multi-country supplier network to reach extreme ultraviolet volume production. China's clock. Domestic extreme ultraviolet capability assessed by analysts as years behind, with no confirmed volume extreme ultraviolet production on Chinese-built tools as of mid-2025. The gap, holding firm at the leading edge, and the domestic tool timeline has not visibly compressed against ASML's frontier since the export controls tightened. Now, the pulse changes hands. Instead of a single extreme ultraviolet exposure drawing a sub-10 nanometer feature in one pass, China's fabs fire the deep ultraviolet source at 193 nanometers and run the wafer through the machine again and again and again. Multi-patterning is the workaround, and it is real physics, not a trick. Layer of photoresist, expose, develop, deposit, etch, strip, return to start. Repeat. Align the next mask. Expose again. Industry observers estimate that reaching 7 nanometer equivalent geometry via deep ultraviolet multi-patterning requires somewhere between 4 and 6 times the number of lithography passes that extreme ultraviolet requires for the same critical layer. That estimate comes from process engineering analysis reported in the trade press. SMIC does not publish its process details, and no independent fab audit has confirmed the exact figure. The geometry is achievable. Analysts who physically decapped the Mate 60 Pro confirmed feature sizes consistent with a 7 nanometer class node. The geometry on the die was real, but TSMC moved to extreme ultraviolet precisely because the multi-patterning alternative was reaching a ceiling. More passes meant more alignment error, more cycle time, more cost per wafer, and more yield loss per layer. TSMC has stated publicly that certain critical layers in its leading-edge nodes require extreme ultraviolet because the multi-patterning alternative is not economically viable at the yield levels their customers require. Multi-patterning is the lithography equivalent of tracing the same line 4 times to make it look like one clean cut. The geometry at the end can be indistinguishable from a single pass if every alignment is perfect, but every retrace is a chance for the hand to drift. And at volume, 100,000 wafers a month, not 10 test wafers. The drift accumulates into yield loss faster than any specification sheet can capture. ASML's clock, expressed as exposure events per critical layer at the leading edge. 1 pass per layer, process time measured in seconds per wafer step. China's clock, expressed in equivalent terms for the same layer via deep ultraviolet multi-patterning, reports suggest 4 to 6 passes, multiplying both cycle time and defect exposure per layer. The gap, compressing in geometry achieved, but the throughput and defect gap has not demonstrably compressed. SMIC is reaching the node number, but the cost and yield profile remains significantly wider than TSMC's equivalent. My read stated plainly, China is not racing to beat ASML. It is racing to lower the bar at which ASML's lead stops mattering commercially. If mature node chips at 7 nanometer equivalent geometry become good enough for the artificial intelligence inference and automotive markets China is targeting, the extreme ultraviolet frontier becomes irrelevant to those use cases. The moat does not compound if no one is trying to cross it at that particular point. That is a different race, with a different finish line, and the workaround clock is already running it. The third leg changes the architecture entirely. Instead of firing patterning light through a lens to draw a feature, photonic imprint lithography presses a physical mold into a photoresist and stamps the geometry directly onto the wafer. No projection optics, no wavelength problem. The physics of diffraction become irrelevant because there is no diffraction, there is contact. Canon has commercialized a version of this approach for certain layers in production settings. Chinese research institutions and startups have published demo reports of similar approaches, and coverage in the technology press has circulated claims of cost reductions relative to deep ultraviolet that the companies involved describe as dramatic. Those figures are company-reported demos. They have not been independently benchmarked at volume production. While China's imprint clock runs its demo phase, the incumbent roadmap does not stand still. ASML's high numerical aperture extreme ultraviolet, the TwinScan EXE series, began shipping to lead customers including Intel and TSMC as of early 2024 by ASML's own announcements. It narrows the numerical aperture, prints even smaller features, and resets the frontier before the workaround clock reaches the previous frontier. The compounding logic of the roadmap is that every generation raises the ceiling that any alternative has to reach. Imprint stamping versus projection lithography is the difference between pressing a cookie cutter into dough and drawing the shape freehand with a precision pen. The cookie cutter is faster and perfectly repeatable. If the cutter itself is perfect and the dough is perfectly uniform, the moment the dough has a bubble or the cutter has a microscopic flaw, every single cookie carries that defect. At wafer scale, uniform dough is not a starting condition. It is the entire engineering challenge, accumulated over years of process development. ASML's roadmap clock, high numerical aperture, extreme ultraviolet in early customer hands as of 2024 by ASML's own statements, with volume production ramp expected across the next product cycle. China's imprint and stamping demo clock, demonstrations reported, cost claims published by the companies involved, volume production timeline not publicly established and not independently confirmed. The gap here, architecturally distinct enough that ahead and behind are not quite the right frame, but the production readiness gap is real and unresolved in either direction. Now, I want to push back against my own earlier read of those splits. I described the multi-patterning workaround as a clock compressor in the second leg, and it is, but I may be flattering the throughput numbers. Every additional deep ultraviolet pass multiplies not just cycle time, but defect probability. Each mask alignment is another chance for the geometry to drift. The split I described was a best-case split. Real production splits, running at commercial volumes with equipment that has been in country for years, without the latest service updates, are likely wider than the demos suggest. The EUV light source operates at 13.5 nanometers. A human hair is roughly 5 million nanometers wide. The feature's extreme ultraviolet draws are so small relative to visible light that if a typical photon of visible light were the size of a tennis ball, an extreme ultraviolet photon would be roughly the width of a pencil lead, and the features it draws would be finer still relative to that pencil lead. The mirrors in the machine are polished to atomic tolerances. That is not a marketing claim. It is the physical requirement for the optics to function at all. Replicating that without the decades of supplier development behind it is not simply a manufacturing challenge. It is a physics challenge with no shortcut. Here is the hypothesis I am testing across this entire video. The real choke point is not the node number on the specification sheet, it is defect density at volume. A chip that reaches 5 nanometer geometry in a demo and collapses to 40% yield in a commercial fab is not a 5 nanometer chip commercially, it is a press release. Whether China's workaround clocks survive contact with volume production is the test this race has not yet run at the scale that matters. The case that China's workaround clock is closer than the splits suggest. The geometry numbers from SMIC's 7 nanometer class chip are real. Physical decap analysis confirmed them. Photonic imprint demos are reproducible in lab conditions. The multi-patterning path is established physics, not speculation. And if China's domestic market for artificial intelligence inference chips, automotive semiconductors, and mature node industrial applications is large enough to sustain a domestic fab ecosystem at yields that would be unacceptable to TSMC, the gap to ASML's frontier may simply stop mattering for those use cases. A chip that runs an inference workload at adequate speed and costs less than the TSMC equivalent, even at lower yield, could still win the market it is actually aimed at. The case that the lead is not a mirage. Yield is not a secondary metric. It is the metric. A fabrication process that produces one working chip per 10 attempts costs 10 times as much per chip as one that produces 9 per 10, independent of what the node number says. SMIC has not published yield figures. The imprint demos have not been stress tested at wafer scale volume with independent defect density measurement. Every leg of China's workaround clock, multi-patterning, imprint, homegrown tools, hits the same wall. Throughput and defect density at the scale of a commercial fab, running hundreds of thousands of wafers per month. The compounding lead is not just in the machine. It is in the process recipes, the equipment matching, the yield learning curves that TSMC and Samsung have accumulated over years of high-volume production on each successive node. That institutional knowledge does not transfer with the hardware, and it does not appear on a specification sheet. The honest synthesis: China has closed the geometry gap on paper and opened a real question about whether the frontier node is the right finish line for the chips it actually needs to build. But the production gap, measured in defect density and throughput at volume, remains real and has not demonstrably compressed. The workaround clock is running. Whether it reaches volume before the use cases outgrow it is the race inside the race. 12 months out, ASML's high numerical aperture, extreme ultraviolet ramp continues with leading-edge customers, and the frontier moves again. SMIC's deep ultraviolet multi-patterning at 7 nanometer class remains the ceiling for China's volume production, with no confirmed extreme ultraviolet volume on domestic tools, and no independently verified photonic imprint production ramp. The geometry gap at the frontier holds or widens. The commercial relevance gap, whether the frontier matters for the chips China actually needs to ship, is the variable most likely to shift in either direction over the next year. My call: ASML's moat compounds faster than China's workaround clock reaches volume on any individual leg. But China does not need to win the lithography race outright. It needs the workaround to be good enough for long enough that domestic demand is served and the pressure to reach the frontier eases. That is a different finish line, and on that narrower race, the gap is genuinely tighter than the hardware specifications suggest. The pulse of patterning light that defines a node is getting shorter. The question is not who controls the shortest pulse today, it is whose clock still sets the cadence for the next one. Here is what I want to know from you. If China's imprint and multi-patterning workarounds reach commercial yield for artificial intelligence inference chips within the next 2 years, does the extreme ultraviolet moat still matter? Or does the frontier become a race that the commercial market stops running? Drop your read in the comments. And if you want to track the splits on this as they move, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next leg of this race is already in progress.